I always want to evoke some enthusiasm from you. So I'm going to pause for a moment, and I want you to stand up. And I want you to do what people hate, which is just take 2 minutes and just say hi to the people. Like, you don't have to go to the back, but just turn around, get some muscles moving. All right, see? You just needed what they call a movement break in my kids' school. There's a favorite quote from those who are biblical literalists. In Malachi 2, verse 16, it says, "I hate divorce." Now, people have created all kinds of statements and rules around this passage. They've used it as the base for shaming people, keeping them in difficult or dangerous situations, all while insisting the Bible is clear. But in the years of hearing conversations and sermons and lectures that refer back to this passage, I've never heard someone use it as anything other than condemnation, rather than something that's about caution or invitation. And so what if that passage is not a simple proclamation of what God is against, but a means for God to communicate to his people through the prophet about a better way, a new way, what we might call an invitation to participate in the renewal of all things, or what I might like to refer today as a move from a dull to a vivid imagination. Walter Brueggemann has a quote from his book, The Prophetic Imagination, that goes something like this. "The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. The alternative consciousness to be nurtured, on the one hand, serves to criticize in dismantling consciousness, and on the other hand, that alternative consciousness to be nurtured serves to energize persons and communities by its promise of another time, another situation toward which the community of faith may move. In thinking this way, the key word is alternative." Now, how many of you, I hope you're settled, and I think I can close. You're good, right? Now, he makes an argument both within this book and in other writings that the Israelites, specifically through their engagement with the leadership of Moses, are invited to be redefined by their encounter with the God who frees them from slavery. Moses introduces them to a God who counters much of what they experienced in Egypt. Where the Pharaoh was interested in domination and conquest, their God was interested in their freedom and liberation. Where the Pharaoh was interested in establishing a mindset of scarcity, their God was interested in demonstrating abundance. Where Pharaoh insisted God was interested in power to control, God, through Moses, demonstrates that there is a higher power at work. That God is far more interested in the flourishing and blessing of all people than power for the sake of winning. And thus the participants in the Exodus found themselves involved in the intentional formation of a new social community to match the vision of God's freedom. Now, you may be wondering, why is she talking about Exodus when we just read Malachi? And I would suggest that the people that are being spoken to by the prophet in Malachi, the descendants of those who come from the Exodus, are being invited back into the intentional formation of a new community. A community that matched God's vision of freedom for what we might suggest is an invitation into the renewal of all things. And what I hope today we will establish is moving from a dull to a vivid imagination. And for us to establish that, we have to first understand what God kind of required from the people, and that this intention of moving from a dull to a vivid imagination is something that God intended from creation onwards. It's then reintroduced to them through the Exodus, and then it's repeated through the various encounters with kings and prophets and different voices. And so once that's established, then we can dive into Malachi chapter 1. Now, this verse in Malachi 1 verse 6 holds this strong rebuke from God to the religious leaders. God announces, "You have shown contempt for my name." The response of those being addressed is confusion. How have we shown contempt to you? And they have good reason to think that. After all, they feel like on paper we're doing everything right. They could say we have followed all of the instructions, we do all of the traditions, we attend all of the festivals, we put on the feasts, we do everything that we have to do. And they think that perhaps they should deserve a gold star and not a word of rebuke. Yet here is God saying, it is contemptible rather than acceptable. The people participated in a religious system of sacrifice. Now, I understand in 2025, the idea of sacrificing animals just doesn't jive with our culture, right? But we have to put our minds into an ancient mindset. We have to go back, and we have to be able to see that while this is difficult from a modern lens, it was the common practice for the various religions that surrounded them. Sacrifice in their context was this act of worship whose intention was to help the people connect with God as a means of offering thanksgiving and remembrance and forgiveness. It was an outward act that connected to their inner spiritual life and was less about transaction and more about relationship. And so while Judah was faithful in offering sacrifices and keeping up the traditions, there was a part that were a part of the historical and cultural fabric. They did so in ways that demonstrated they didn't actually think the process of relating with God was important, was worthy, and should require the cost that the sacrifice did. But they were careful to not completely abandon the process, right? You still want to be able to say, so I don't know if I've told this story about when I was a teacher and my students, we were at an event, and then my students were found in the top of a trophy case. I was a great teacher. So, and then when I said, why would you do that? And they were like, because you didn't tell us not to. So this is kind of their attitude. This is their attitude around offerings. They would rather choose the worst than what is best. They would rather simply do what the law requires than to lean in with their whole hearts. And so to offer this lame and blind and crippled, stolen and diseased animals as a part of their worship, God says, you know you wouldn't even give it to someone who holds any kind of position of authority or leadership, yet you are comfortable giving it to me, which in turn demonstrates how little they think about God and how little they think about God's role in their community and in their lives. And what stands out in this passage is it's interesting that the prophet says, actually, if you look all around you, there are nations who give sacrifice to me, who offer incense to me, even though they don't have that same covenantal relationship that you, Judah, hold with the God of your ancestors. And God says something audacious. He says, I would rather you stop worshiping altogether rather than to offer something worthless. Yikes. And hidden in these lines is the reminder that not only are they offering the worst of what they have, they do so knowing that what they bring breaks the covenantal laws established between them and God, and it defies one of the principles that Moses offered to the people during the Exodus, that the God of their ancestors was not the same as the gods of Egypt, nor would their God employ the same actions as Pharaoh. Yet when they give the worst of what they have to God, it suggests something about what they believe. For when they refuse to give their best and instead give their worst, the things that are stolen and unfit to offer anyone, they announce they do not believe that God can be trusted. They don't believe God can be trusted to maintain the covenant, to provide for them, or to sustain them. And so when God says, you have shown contempt for my name, this is not a conversation about offering a better cut of beef or a better looking bird. This is not about a God who is greedy and hard to please. What is being referenced is that they do not believe that God is going to hold up God's end of the covenant. They don't believe that who God says they are is who God is. And so rather than take the risk on a God that they don't trust, that they don't believe is on their side, that they do not imagine desires good for them, they choose to bet on themselves. They imagine if they are to give what they ought to discard or leave behind, they will create the perfect environment to assure in their own power, in their own strength, with their own will and their own way, that they will have enough for tomorrow, that they will have enough to sustain them, to create progress for themselves, and to ensure that those who might want to surpass them or take advantage of them are ill-equipped. And God sees and knows and understands that they are suggesting God is not a God of covenant. They are announcing that God's promises will fail and that God will not do what they said they will do. And so God suggests, if your imagination is so dull that you think the only way forward and the only way ahead is to live as though you are still under the threat of the gods of Egypt, if you think that the only way forward is to still live as though Pharaoh and Babylon are where you will attain your freedom, and that somehow the imperial ideas of those who sought to bind you are greater than the liberation I have promised you, if that is the mindset that you imagine is equated with worship of God, the God of heaven, the God of earth, the God of your ancestors, the God who declared with all power and passion, I have always loved you, and my covenant promises will not be broken. If that scarcity mindset of all the gods of your enemies is what you associate with worship of me, I do not want it. Your imagination is so dull. Your picture of who I am is so opaque. Your ideas of who I am and what it is I am trying to do in you and around you are so colorless and grayscale and unimaginative that I don't want it. I don't want you to use the tools of Pharaoh and to call it worship. I don't want you to mimic Babylon and call it godliness. I don't want you to live by scarcity and then call it faith. Do you hear me? I don't want it. Oh, come on. It's actually a hard pill to swallow because Babylon and Pharaoh, they kind of rule the world. So God says, I would rather you neglect the act of worship than to worship with actions that bring contempt to my name. You are operating with a dull imagination. Because when I freed you from Egypt, when I sent manna from heaven, when you made your way to the promised land, when you were given favor by your enemies and victory in spaces where you should have found defeat, when I sent fire from heaven, when I made it rain after years of drought, when I kept you in the midst of Babylon and sent you home with the capacity to defend and to rebuild, it was all with a single intention, that you would move forward, that you would build, that you would be a neighbor, that you would be worshipers, that you would be the voice of God to those around you, and you would do so with a vivid imagination of what it looks like to enact my vision of freedom for you, for your community, for your region, for wherever it is that your life takes you. And that vision looks nothing like Pharaoh. That vision does not emulate and celebrate Babylon. That vision is not formed by the notion of scarcity leading to domination, oppression, and conquest. And in case you think I'm stretching that analogy too far, I want us to go to Malachi chapter 2. And here the prophet continues, and he says, this is what was intended by the religious leaders to pass on to the worshiping communities and the surrounding nations. He says, the purpose of my covenant with the priests in particular was that they would bring life and peace. They were to pass on to the people the truth of the instructions they received from God. And originally, they did not lie, they did not cheat. They walked with God, living good and righteous lives, and they turned people away from sin. But you, the current iteration of religious voices and leaders, you have left behind the task of passing on your knowledge of who I am to the people and have instead chosen favoritism in the way you carry out my instructions, which means you pick and you choose. You choose what it means to lead the people according to what you want to do, according to what serves you, according to what challenges you the least. And all of that demonstrates a dull imagination. And so for those who wonder, why does God care so much about this issue? After all, the priests and Levites are just one tribe out of 12. God understands that an imagination that is not connected with life and peace, an imagination that leans into scarcity, an imagination that resembles that of Pharaoh and that of Babylon, is designed and destined to multiply. A dull imagination is easily multiplied. It easily spread. It is easily replicated because it leans into our default. It leans into our default, which insists there isn't enough to go around, that power at its best should lead to accumulation and increase, that dominance and conquering are the way forward, and that the strong should be expected to succeed, and the weak should just fall in line. A dull imagination leans into our default setting and tells the lie that the tools of Babylon and Pharaoh are easily justifiable as a tool of the godly because they lead to what appears to be blessing for a few. And for the few who receive whatever it is they get from this, they then lean into the temptation to announce, but if you just did it our way, if you just took on this scarcity mindset, if you just take up this task of accumulation, if you just accepted a little bit of violence, if you just understood the rules of power, if you can just make a small shift here and there, then you too can experience this blessing. But what it ignores is that when you call blessing those things that are connected with Pharaoh and with Babylon and with scarcity, what is missed is that it is only good for some. But it leads to violence, it leads to loss, it leads to fear, it leads to conquer and impoverishment, it leads to hopelessness for another. What you call a blessing is what God might call a corruption of the covenant. And that kind of dull imagination and the harm that is provoked is easily multiplied. In Malachi 2:10, verse 16, you catch a glimpse of the ways that what the priests have condoned and what they have participated in, what they have celebrated and announced through their actions, have begun to permeate and shift society. And this is when the prophet goes into the bedrooms of the nation. They begin to critique who they are marrying. They say, you've begun to marry those who are from foreign nations and you adopt their foreign gods as your own. Now, on one hand, God is perhaps talking about an individual, but he's really focusing on a nation. A nation has turned from God and they have begun to take on the gods of their neighbors. And he says this is a clear indicator that the people's imagination is no longer focused simply on life and peace. It's no longer focused on pursuing God's vision of freedom, and they have exchanged it for the vision of the gods of their neighbors. And this dull imagination that began with the spiritual leaders, those who have misused and misheld spiritual authority, begins to trickle down to the families. And the prophet says, God sees how the vows that people made to their wives when they were young are not being upheld, even though their wife remains faithful. God is speaking once again to a nation and also to individuals who have chosen a dull imagination to frame how they engage with God, how they engage with their neighbors, how they engage with those closest to them. God is standing against those who would misuse their power or their position in an effort to discard their covenant partners for selfish gain. In the case of the micro situation of husbands and wives, God says, because you have set your eyes on something you think is better, despite no evidence of mistrust or mistreatment, you sacrifice the good of the woman to appease your selfish inclination. This in particular is not so much a conversation about relationships, but it is a conversation about justice. When we speak about an ancient community where the woman's value and ability to thrive are directly connected to the men in their life, from their father to their husbands, when those relationships get dismantled unjustly, Scripture says it's an act of cruelty. And so it is as a nation. That when their imagination becomes dull, they are willing to sacrifice the covenant relationship with God to appease their selfish inclination that imagines the gods of Pharaoh, the ways of Babylon, the message of scarcity and not enough are more worthy of worship, are more worthy of sacrifice, are more worthy of personal commitment and alignment than the God who has been faithful to them, than the God who has been present, than the God whose history with them has repeatedly demonstrated that when they were vulnerable, God was their protector. When they lacked, God was their provider. When they found themselves caught between a rock and a hard place, it was God who made a way through the water and the wilderness, through the territory owned by their enemies. Yet their imagination has grown so dull that they can no longer imagine in the same direction of God's vision for flourishing life and peace. Now they imagine, they can't envision what is possible. Instead, they live and respond and engage and worship as ones who lean in to Pharaoh, rather than recognizing that Pharaoh is defeated. Rather than understanding that Babylon could not keep them, nor could Babylon hold them. That scarcity has been proved a liar, and that the gods around them are nothing more than idols used to prop up systems to keep fear rising and imagination stagnant. The people have become so used to moving away from where God is leading and what God is speaking that they have become opposed to the vision that requires a vivid imagination. They actually become opposed to the vision that is about their own freedom. They become opposed to the vision that is about the freedom of all people. In exchange for fear, in exchange for the message from the gods, in exchange for the message of Pharaoh and Babylon, in exchange for all those things that leave their imagination dull. And I think it's important to remember that Pharaoh, that Babylon, that fear and scarcity lose their power when we move from dull to vivid imaginations. We might want to believe the lie of what can be attained and gained from those systems. But the reality is that Pharaoh and Babylon, fear and scarcity, they lose power as we move from dull to vivid imaginations. We might want to lean into something else, but it's important to remember that Pharaoh and Babylon, fear and scarcity, lose power as we move from dull to vivid imaginations that extend life and peace, blessing and flourishing, and declare the renewal of all things is what God intended. My youngest son has a vivid imagination. He's so cute. And he knows it. So if you see him, he feels slighted when people don't comment on his adorability. So he has this big imagination, so much more than the rest of us. And so we've kind of had to follow his lead. He approaches me with those big eyes and tells me how one of his stuffed animals refused to listen and needed to apologize to the rest of the crew. On another day, he will tell me how the teacher gave him a map to go to her house after school because we're going there for dinner. Or he'll explain a long conversation he had with a friend at school with such intensity that when I say, I think I need to talk to the teacher about that, then he says, oh, no. Don't ask the teacher if that person threw me on the ground. And while most times I'm pretty sure about what is real and what is imagined, sometimes he says things that kind of leave my heart pounding. On one day, he said, "There's a man in my room," which I was like, what? And then he starts laughing. He says, "No, I mean outside. The people who are mowing the lawn, they're outside." And I was like, get it right. And so while sometimes his stories kind of make my heart skip a beat, I am really cautious not to crush his imagination or his art for storytelling. For seeing what is not, for living in full color and communicating that with vibrancy. Because I think somewhere along the way he's going to lose it. And I think somewhere along the way we lose our capacity to imagine with that kind of veracity. And we simply kind of go on to live in black and white. Malachi reveals to us how easy it is to slip into a dull imagination, to lose sight of God's vision for the world and our call to participate in what God is doing right beside us and all around us. It's easy to slip into a dull imagination because so much announces that the way forward requires the tools and interventions and strategies that are so well packaged and offer us the voices of power, that offer us an extension of our ego, that offer us fear that we can control, and speak to us about opportunities we hope for, and ask us to lean into the scars that have defined us. And just like we might stop imagining a vibrant world as we grow older, from children to adults, so it is easy to lose sight of God's vivid vision for the world around us. When our faith gets confronted, when our prayers don't seem to be answered, when our encounters with the church and those who we are intended to trust leave us heartbroken and uncertain, and we come to the conclusion that a dull imagination is a safe imagination, and we come to imagine that a dull imagination is just what growing up is all about. After all, it makes more sense to be realistic and muted in the ways we follow God, to trust God and lean to the ways we follow God, rather than to trust in and lean into God's message of the kingdom. And it doesn't take much for us to move from imagining equity to leaning into feigned meritocracy. It doesn't take much for us from seeing the fruit of diversity to being compelled to just seek conformity. It doesn't take much for us to move from a life of curiosity to one of certainty, from the pursuit of enough for everyone to a simple resignation into scarcity. It doesn't take much for us to move from a path forged by courage to one made by our greatest fears. It is easy for our imaginations to move from dull and muted to gray to black and white. But what if the story and the message from the book of Malachi is somehow mirrored in the teachings of Jesus? What if they are an invitation for us to move from a dull to vivid imagination? When we turn from Malachi and look to the Gospels, we meet the fullness of God's imagination made visible. In Jesus, the abstract vision becomes incarnate. God's vivid imagination walks among us, touching the untouchable, seeing the unseen, and naming the forgotten. Every parable that Jesus tells is a protest against a dull imagination. When Jesus says the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, he's inviting us to see that power can start from something small. When he says the last will be first, he is reordering a world that seeks to live only by hierarchy and conquest. When he turns water into wine and feeds the thousands, when he lifts the face of the poor and forgives those who crucified him, he is painting the world back into color. Each miracle, each table shared, each boundary crossed was God's vivid imagination breaking into the grayscale of empire. Jesus embodied what Malachi longed for, a people whose worship was not dull, whose faith was not reduced to ritual, whose lives revealed the covenant of life and peace. And if we dare to follow that same Jesus today, then we too must reclaim our vivid imagination. Because dull imagination is not just a problem of ancient Israel, it is the mark of every age that forgets wonder, that trades community for competition, that mistakes accumulation for blessing, that calls comfort peace while others struggle to breathe. A dull imagination says this is just the way things have to be, and a vivid imagination says this is what could be if God's kingdom is near. A dull imagination builds walls, but a vivid imagination extends tables. A dull imagination seeks safety, and a vivid imagination seeks transformation. A dull imagination wants to preserve what is, and a vivid imagination joins God in creating something new. A vivid imagination, the one God dreams for us through Christ, dares to see differently. Can you sense the Spirit inviting us, like those who may have heard the words of the prophet, to participate in the renewal of all things? To trade our dull and safe, predictable patterns for the radiant, risky imagination of the kingdom. So maybe the invitation in Malachi, the cry of the prophets, and the ministry of Jesus have an invitation and a caution for our day and our time. Move from dull to vivid. Move from grayscale faith to that which is living and breathing in color. Move from fear to trust, from scarcity to abundance, from mere worship as an act of tradition to worship that seeks life and peace for all people. You guys can come up. For Pharaoh and Babylon, fear and scarcity still lose power when God's people dare to imagine vividly. And this imagination is how we come to live out our calling to participate in the renewal of all things. And all things being made as God intended from the beginning, from creation. Because that is the vision of God. That is what we are invited to imagine into reality. This is the gospel we are invited to live. This is the story we're invited to offer. From dull to vivid, from fear to trust, from scarcity to abundance, from mere worship as an act of tradition to worship that seeks life and peace for all people. Amen. Is that something you say amen to? Let your will be done. Let your kingdom come. Let it be on earth as it is in heaven. It is that leads us to a vivid imagination, a way forward that looks and sees God's vision for freedom, God's vision for life and peace for all people, and then allows us to walk in that way and to create change and to speak life and to be present in situations where God has called us to. In Isaiah, it says this: I am the Lord, your Holy One, Israel's creator and king. I am the Lord who opened a way through the waters, making a dry path through the sea. I called forth the mighty army of Egypt with all of its chariots and horses. I drew them beneath the waves, and they drowned, their lives snuffed out like smoldering candlewick. But forget all of that. It's nothing compared to what I am going to do, for I am about to do something new. See, I've already begun. Do you not see it? I will make a pathway through the wilderness. I will create rivers in the dry wasteland. The wild animals in the fields will thank me, the jackals and owls too, for giving them water in the desert. Yes, I will make rivers in the dry wasteland so my people can be refreshed. Go with that, and I encourage you to think about all of the ways that you can move from a dull to a vivid imagination. Have a blessed week.